I slid the folder across the conference table and watched my sister's face do something I had never seen it do before. She looked down at the cover page, and her hand, the one with the new Cartier bracelet she had bought herself with money that was not entirely hers, went very still. Not frozen, still. The way a person goes still when they realize the exit they thought was behind them has already been locked. I had been an auditor for 12 years. I knew exactly what a person's body does when they see their own name on a forensic report. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments because I always read them, every single one. I'm going to tell you a story today that took me 3 years to live through and about 14 months to prepare for. There are people in my family who still believe I went too far. Some of them stopped returning my calls after that board meeting. I want you to hear everything that happened, every single detail, and then I want you to tell me whether you think I crossed a line, because I genuinely want to know. I thought about this moment for so long, and now that it is over, I still turn it over in my head sometimes at 2 in the morning, wondering if a different version of me would have handled it differently. The version of me who was less patient, less precise. But that is not the version of me who showed up that day. I showed up with a folder, 12 years of professional training, and 14 months of documented evidence, and I placed it on the table without raising my voice even once. To understand why that folder existed, I need to take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of my life. I am not going to put you through a full biography, just the beginning of the business, because that is where this story really lives. My name is Renata Solano. I am 38 years old, and for the last 9 years I have been the chief financial officer of Solano Family Interiors, a design and furnishing company that my parents founded in the mid-90s in a small city in the Pacific Northwest. My parents, Guillermo and Fernanda Solano, built that company from a small storefront into something real, a regional operation with 4 showroom locations, a commercial contract division, and a reputation that my mother spent 30 years protecting. When my father's health started declining in 2019, he stepped back from day-to-day operations and handed operational control to the 3 of us, me, my older sister Claudia, and our younger brother Tomás. My father retained his voting shares, my mother retained hers, but the 3 of us, Claudia, Tomás, and I, were supposed to be running the company together, a genuine partnership. I want you to understand something about Claudia Solano before I go any further, because she is the kind of person who is very easy to misread if you only see the surface. She is 4 years older than me, and she has a quality that I can only describe as performed warmth. She hugs people when they cry. She remembers birthdays with handwritten cards. She has a laugh that fills a room and makes everyone feel like they were the funniest person alive. Growing up, I adored her. She was the big sister who taught me to drive in an empty parking lot and stayed up with me the night before my college entrance exams. For the first 30 years of my life, I would have called Claudia my closest friend. She's also one of the most strategically deceptive people I have ever encountered, and I am a trained forensic auditor. I have seen a lot of deception. Tomás is different. 3 years younger than me, quieter, more interested in the design side of the business than the financial side. He had a gift for the work itself, for understanding what a client actually wanted when they said they wanted something timeless, and he had been the creative director of Solano Family Interiors since 2017. Tomás is not a bad person. He is a person who, for a long time, found it easier to go along with Claudia than to question her. That distinction matters, and I will come back to it. My parents had structured the company with a board of 5 voting members, themselves, Claudia, Tomás, and me. For day-to-day operations, Claudia held the title of Chief Executive Officer. I was Chief Financial Officer. Tomás was Chief Creative Director. On paper, the 3 of us had equal authority. In practice, Claudia had been the oldest child for 38 years, and in our family, that had always counted for something. My father still called her mi capitana, my captain. He said it affectionately, but Claudia heard it as a job title. I had come into the CFO role after 12 years in public accounting. I had my CPA license, and I had spent 6 years at a regional audit firm before joining a national firm where I led forensic audit engagements. When my father asked me to step into the role, I had just finished a major engagement for a manufacturing client, and the timing felt right. I believed in the business. I believed in what my parents had built, and I genuinely believed at that time that working with my siblings would be one of the best decisions of my life. I moved back to my parents' city in the spring of 2019. I bought a small house 8 blocks from the company's main showroom. I joined the board. I inherited a set of financial systems that had grown organically over 30 years and needed significant restructuring, and I got to work. The first 6 months were genuinely good. I updated the accounting structure, rebuilt the monthly reporting process, and negotiated better terms with 2 major suppliers. The commercial contract division had been underperforming, and I identified why. We were pricing our contracts too conservatively relative to our actual costs. I restructured the pricing model, and in the second half of 2019, the commercial division's margin improved by 11 points. Claudia sent me a congratulatory email. She CC'd our parents. She told me at dinner that she was glad I had come home. I should have noticed then that her definition of glad had a very specific ceiling. The thing about family businesses is that they compress dynamics that in a normal corporate environment would be spread across departments, org charts, and layers of professional distance. In a family business, the person who undermines you in a meeting is also the person sitting across from you at Thanksgiving. The person who takes credit for your work is also the person you have known your entire life. It is harder to see clearly. Love blurs edges that would otherwise be sharp, and Claudia was very good, extraordinarily good, at keeping those edges blurry. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was small enough that I almost dismissed it. It was February of 2020, about 9 months after I had joined the company. We had a quarterly board meeting, and I had prepared a detailed financial presentation that included a proposal for restructuring our vendor payment schedule to improve cash flow. It was a technical proposal, detailed, and I had worked on it for 3 weeks. At the meeting, I walked through the presentation slide by slide. When I got to the vendor restructuring section, Claudia interrupted me. She did not interrupt me rudely. She never did anything rudely. She tilted her head to the side the way she always did when she was about to soften a dismissal, and she said, "Dad, maybe Renata can send this around later. I think for today we should focus on the Bellingham expansion." My father nodded. My mother looked mildly uncertain but said nothing. Tomas was looking at his phone. The conversation moved on. I sat very still. I finished the meeting. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what had just happened. Claudia had not addressed my proposal. She had not questioned it or argued against it. She had simply erased it from the agenda gracefully with a pleasant pivot, and nobody had even noticed, including me for a split second. She was that smooth. I sent the vendor restructuring proposal by email to the full board that evening. I noted that it had not been fully addressed in the meeting and asked for a vote. Claudia replied the next morning with a brief note saying we should schedule time to discuss further. That discussion never happened. The proposal was never formally rejected. It simply ceased to exist. I called my attorney, Priya Nandan, the following week, not because I had anything to report yet, just because I wanted to start keeping notes somewhere that was not a notebook I might lose. Priya is a business attorney I had worked with briefly at my prior firm, and she had a way of listening to things and identifying the one sentence that mattered most. When I finished telling her about the board meeting, she said, "Has she done this before?" I said I was not sure. She said, "Start tracking it." I did. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to be on your side, someone who smiled at you while they were doing it, you know exactly what the next 12 months felt like. It is a particular kind of invisible, the kind that is hard to name because the person doing it never raises their voice. The Bellingham expansion Claudia had redirected us toward was a genuine business opportunity, a new showroom location in a growing market. I supported it. I built the financial model for it. We opened the Bellingham location in October of 2020 in the middle of a complicated year, and it performed well from the start. I am not going to pretend that Claudia did not have good business instincts, because she did. The tragedy of what she was doing, and I did not understand the full shape of it yet, is that she was genuinely capable. She did not need to steal. She had the intelligence and the skill to succeed legitimately, but something in her could not accept that success unless it came with control, and control in our family had always meant being more than me. By the spring of 2021, I had been keeping notes for 14 months. The pattern was consistent. Any initiative I brought to the board was either delayed, redirected, or quietly absorbed into something Claudia then presented as her own idea. My compensation review, which was supposed to happen annually, had been deferred twice, once because of the pandemic disruption, once because of what Claudia described as timing without further explanation. My salary was $212,000 annually, which was below market for a CFO of a company our size. When I raised this in a one-on-one with Claudia, she patted my hand, actually physically patted my hand, and told me we needed to focus on reinvesting in the business before we could revisit executive compensation. I smiled. I had closed a consulting engagement the prior month through my own independent practice, which I had maintained quietly and which generated additional income. I was not suffering, but that was not the point. The point was that she was making a decision that was not hers alone to make, presenting it to me as though it were settled, and she had not even noticed what she was doing. That is the thing about people who are used to a particular kind of power. They stop tracking whether they earned it, they just assume it belongs to them. I did not know yet about the money. I did not know yet the full scale of what was happening beneath the surface of the company's financials. But I was starting to feel it the way you feel a current in water before you can see it, a faint pull in a direction you did not intend to go. And that was when I began to look more carefully at the numbers. The financial structure of Solano Family Interiors had some quirks that were, to an outside eye, normal for a family business of its generation. My parents had built it organically, which meant the financial systems had grown in layers rather than being designed from the top down. There were accounts that had been opened in the 90s that were still active but only loosely documented in the current chart of accounts. There were vendor relationships that were invoiced through personal accounts because that was how my father had done it when the company was small and those habits had never been formally cleaned up. There was a discretionary expense account, an older one, established about 15 years back that my father had used for what he called relationship expenses, meaning client dinners, gifts, and other legitimate business development costs. When I first took over as CFO, I had flagged this account as something we needed to formalize. It had minimal controls. Anyone with signatory authority could draw from it. My father had the discipline to use it appropriately because the money was his company. Claudia, who had been given signatory authority over it 2 years before I joined, apparently had a different interpretation of discretionary. I did not see the full picture until much later, but in March of 2021, I started running a quiet reconciliation on that account's transaction history. Not a full audit. I did not have the formal mandate to conduct one yet. Just a reconciliation, just looking at what was there. What I found in those first few weeks of looking was enough to make me stop, close my laptop, and sit quietly in my office for about 4 minutes without doing anything. The discretionary account had processed approximately $180,000 in transactions over the previous 18 months that I could not immediately tie to any documented business purpose. Not all of it was clearly improper, some of it was ambiguous, which in forensic accounting is actually worse in some ways because it is harder to categorize. But a subset of those transactions, maybe $40,000 to $50,000 worth in that first pass, were explicitly personal. A payment to a home renovation contractor, 3 payments to a luxury travel agency, 2 payments to a private school, and Claudia's daughter was in private school. My father did not have any grandchildren enrolled in private school at that time. I closed the file. I opened a new document. And I started writing down everything I had found in a structured format with dates and amounts and transaction references. Then I saved that document in an encrypted folder on a personal external drive that I kept at home, not in the office. I called Priya that evening. "Tell me what you found," she said. I told her. There was a pause, not a long one. Priya is not a person who takes long pauses. She said, "How long have you been looking?" "About 3 weeks," I said. "And you found that much in 3 weeks?" "Yes, Renata." She said my name in a very particular tone that I recognized from working with her before. It was the tone she used when she was calibrating how serious something was. "If you go further back, if you do a comprehensive review of that account and any connected accounts, what do you think you are going to find?" I told her what I thought. She was quiet for another moment. "I want you to do something for me," she said finally. "I want you to not touch those files again, not as the CFO of this company, until we have a conversation about how to do this correctly. Because if you go in there with CFO authority and then this becomes a legal matter, we want to make sure everything you find is obtained in a way that cannot be challenged later." I agreed. I put the documents away, and I waited, but I kept paying attention, because that is what you do when you are a forensic auditor and you have found a thread. You do not pull it, not yet. You trace where it goes. The spring of 2021 moved into the summer. The business was performing reasonably well overall. The Bellingham location was profitable. Our commercial contract division had a strong second quarter. On the surface, Solano family interiors looked healthy. At family dinners, my mother cooked my father's favorite food, and we sat around the table and talked about expansion plans and my brother's new apartment and Claudia's daughter's school performance and my parents' upcoming anniversary trip. We were, to anyone watching, a close and prosperous family business. Claudia was warm at those dinners. She poured my wine before I asked for it. She asked about my consulting work with genuine seeming interest. She told the story of how I had restructured the commercial pricing model, usually to someone who had not heard it, and gave me full credit every time. She was generous with my competence in settings where it did not threaten her authority. I watched her very carefully at those dinners, not in a way anyone could see. I would be talking about something completely unrelated, and I would be watching how she held her shoulders when my father praised her, watching how she looked at me when she thought I was not looking back. There was something in that look that I had never quite named before. It was not dislike, it was closer to assessment, like she was always calculating the distance between where I was and where I could become a problem. She had been calculating for years. I just had not known what she was calculating. In July of 2021, I hired a forensic accounting consultant. His name was David Kwon, and he had been recommended to me by Priya. David was an independent practitioner who specialized in family business disputes, and he was known for being meticulous and discreet. I engaged him personally, not through the company. I paid him out of my own funds. I gave him the transaction data I had already compiled and asked him to assess what, if anything, it might suggest. He came back to me 2 weeks later with a preliminary assessment that was carefully worded and professionally measured and absolutely devastating. The transactions I had flagged were consistent with a pattern he called sustained systematic diversion. He wanted access to a broader data set before forming a final opinion, but based on what I had given him, he believed the total exposure could be significantly larger than what I had seen. I asked him what significantly larger might mean. He said he would know more after a full review. He said to be prepared. I sat with that for 3 days before I did anything else. I went to work every morning. I ran the usual CFO functions. I approved payroll, reviewed the monthly close, responded to Claudia's emails promptly and professionally. I sat in a strategy meeting where she presented a proposal for expanding our residential design services, a good proposal actually, and I asked thoughtful questions and voted in favor. I had dinner with my parents on a Thursday and helped my mother carry dishes from the kitchen and told my father about a book he might like. I did not say anything to anyone about what David Kwon had told me. Because the thing Claudia had never understood about me, had never bothered to understand, I think, because she had stopped seeing me as someone worth understanding closely, was that I had 12 years of forensic audit experience. I had sat across from people who had stolen from their employers and their partners and their own families, and I had watched those people be confronted with evidence, and I had learned something from all of those engagements that is not in any textbook. The lesson is this: the evidence is not the hard part. The hard part is the stage. You can have every document, every transaction record, every signed invoice. If you present it in the wrong venue to the wrong audience at the wrong moment, it gets buried, it gets lawyered away, it becomes a family dispute instead of an accounting matter. And Claudia was very good at making things become family disputes. I needed the right stage, and I was going to build it. But first, I had to understand exactly how much she had taken. And I had to do that carefully, legally, and in a way that left no door open for her to claim I had acted improperly. The process of getting a formal audit mandate took 4 months. I will not walk you through every step because some of it is procedural and not the point. The short version is that Priya helped me identify a mechanism in the company's governing documents, a shareholders' agreement provision that had been in place since the company was incorporated, that allowed any 2 board members to request an independent financial review of specific company accounts if they had documented concerns. My father still held board voting rights. My father trusted me. And my father, when I sat down with him privately in September of 2021 and told him, quietly and carefully, that I had preliminary concerns about the financial integrity of the discretionary account and 1 or 2 related accounts, went very still in a way that broke my heart a little. He did not say anything for a long time. He looked at his hands, then he looked at me. "Are you sure?" he said. "I have preliminary concerns," I told him. "I want to do this correctly. I want an independent review so that whatever we find, if we find anything, it cannot be challenged." He nodded slowly. He asked me not to tell my mother yet. I agreed. He asked if I had talked to Claudia. "No," I said. "Not yet." He nodded again. And then he signed the document Priya had drafted that formally authorized a third-party independent audit of the specified accounts. We engaged an audit firm, not mine, a different one with no prior relationship to the company, and they began their work in October of 2021. Claudia was notified that an independent review was being conducted as part of a routine governance assessment. That was the framing we used: routine governance assessment. Claudia's response was a pleasant email saying she thought it was a great idea and offering full cooperation. She offered the audit team access to everything they needed. She was professionally gracious about it. She was not worried. I knew she was not worried because she sent that email within 20 minutes of receiving the notification, and she did not call me. If she had been worried, she would have called me. She would have found some graceful way to probe what I knew. The fact that she did not call told me she believed she was covered. That was information too. The audit team spent 11 weeks. David Kwon served as my personal technical advisor throughout the process, reviewing their methodology, flagging areas I wanted them to look more closely at, helping me understand their preliminary findings. There is a discipline to watching an audit unfold when you already have a suspicion about the outcome, and that discipline is patience. You do not lead the auditors. You let them find what is there to be found. And you wait. The preliminary findings came back in January of 2022. $627,000 over 3 years. I remember reading the number in the preliminary report and feeling something that was not quite shock because I had been preparing myself for a large number, and was not quite relief because relief was not the right word for this moment. It was something closer to a cold, clear recognition. Like finally seeing the full shape of something you had been touching in the dark for 2 years. $627,000, diverted through a combination of the discretionary expense account, a vendor account for a company that existed only on paper, and a series of reimbursement claims that had been processed through the payroll system using approvals that appeared, on the surface, legitimate. Paper company, a supposed interior design consultant called Meridian Creative Group, had been receiving invoices from Solano Family Interiors for work that was never performed. The invoices were well constructed. The amounts were varied enough that none of them individually stood out. The pattern only became visible when you looked at them together over time with the full transaction history in front of you. I knew what Meridian Creative Group was as soon as I saw the name in the audit report. I had seen that name once before, about 8 months earlier, on a document I had not been supposed to see. A document that had been left on the printer in the main office and that I had picked up thinking it was a standard vendor invoice and had glanced at before setting down. At the time, I had not made the connection. I had filed it away as something to check later and then gotten distracted by the monthly close. It had been there the whole time. I had touched the thread and not pulled it. I closed the preliminary report. I called Priya. "How solid is this?" she said when I had walked her through the findings. "Solid enough that they are going to issue a formal opinion," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Who knows about this right now? You, me, the audit team, and David. Your father, he authorized the audit. He knows a review is happening. He doesn't know the findings yet." "Okay," she said. "We need to talk about sequencing." Sequencing, that was the word that mattered, because $627,000 in fraudulent diversion is not just a financial problem. It is a legal matter, a family matter, and a governance matter simultaneously. The order in which you address each layer determines the outcome. Get it wrong and you end up in a years-long dispute where lawyers extract most of the recovered funds and the company is destabilized and the family never speaks again. Get it right and you have a clean, documented resolution that is legally defensible and structurally complete. I had been thinking about sequencing for months. But now that the number was real, now that I had $627,000 sitting in a preliminary audit report, the sequencing became urgent. Priya and I met in her office the following week. She had brought in a colleague, a corporate litigator named Harrison Embeke who specialized in business fraud recovery. He was a methodical, quiet man who read documents very slowly and asked questions in a sequence that covered every angle. He reviewed the preliminary findings that morning and asked me 11 specific questions. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "What outcome are you trying to achieve?" I had thought about this question so many times that I answered without hesitating. "I want full restitution to the company. I want the governance structure of the company protected so that my parents' legacy is intact. I want a resolution that is legally airtight. And I want to be present when my sister is confronted with this evidence." Harrison looked at me for a moment. "That last part," he said, "why does that matter to you?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about 14 months of notes. I thought about the vendor restructuring proposal that disappeared from a meeting agenda. I thought about my salary being deferred while Claudia paid private school tuition out of a company account. I thought about every dinner where she poured my wine and told my story to someone new, and I sat there feeling the current pulling in a direction I did not intend to go. "Because she's been making decisions that affected me for 3 years," I said, without ever looking me in the eye when she did it. "I want to be in the room. I want her to look at me when she understands that I know." Harrison nodded slowly. He made a note. He said, "Then we design a board meeting." And that was when we started building the stage. The formal audit report was completed and certified in February of 2022. Priya and Harrison advised that before any confrontation, we needed several things in place. First, we needed my father fully briefed, not generally, but specifically with the full report in his hands. Second, we needed to ensure the company's bank accounts had appropriate protective controls so that no assets could be moved during the period between the confrontation and any legal resolution. Third, we needed to have a resolution proposal ready, a formal document outlining the restitution terms and the governance changes we were requesting, so that the board meeting was not just a revelation but a decision point. Briefing my father was the hardest thing I have done in this entire process. I went to my parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. My mother was at a luncheon with friends. It was intentionally when she would be out because I needed this conversation to be with my father alone first. He was in his study when I arrived, reading, and he looked up when I came in with the folder under my arm and something in his expression changed. He knew. He had known, I think, since September when I had asked him to authorize the audit. Some part of him had always known that the ask was more specific than a routine governance assessment. I sat across from him and I opened the folder and I walked him through the report page by page. I did not soften it. I did not editorialize. I gave him the facts in the order they appeared in the report and I let him sit with each section before I moved to the next. He did not cry. My father is not a man who cries easily, but at some point while I was talking, he put his reading glasses on the desk and he did not pick them up again for the rest of the conversation. His hand stayed very flat on the desk surface, completely still. It reminded me oddly of how Claudia's hand had gone still when I imagined that opening scene, the scene I was still building toward. When I finished, we sat quietly for several minutes. "How long?" he said finally. "The documented period is 3 years. It may have started earlier. The auditors focused their scope on the period where the documentation was most complete. And you found this?" "Yes, because you were looking." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for, the question I had rehearsed answering because I knew it was coming. He said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. I told him about Priya and Harrison. I told him about the sequencing. I told him about the board meeting and the resolution proposal. I told him that I believed the right path was one that protected the company, protected his legacy, gave Claudia the opportunity to make full restitution and address the governance failures that had allowed this to happen. I told him that I believed this should be handled as a business matter before it became a legal matter, but that if it needed to become a legal matter, I was prepared for that. He listened to all of it without interrupting. At the end, he said, "Will Claudia go to prison?" I told him honestly that I did not know. That depended in part on whether she cooperated and in part on decisions that were not mine to make. I told him that my goal was not criminal prosecution, my goal was restitution and governance reform. But I also told him that the documented evidence was what it was, and if it was referred to a prosecutor, the outcome would be out of either of our hands. He sat with that. He picked up his glasses finally and held them without putting them on. "She is still my daughter," he said. "I know," I said. "She is still my sister." That was the moment of genuine human connection in this story that I think about the most. Not the revelation, not the confrontation, not the resolution. Just my father sitting in his study holding his reading glasses and saying she's still my daughter, and me saying I know she's still my sister. Because both things were true. They stayed true through all of it. The money she had taken did not undo 38 years of being her sister. It just changed what being her sister meant. We agreed on the plan. My father would be present at the board meeting. He would not speak first. He had asked me to let him process everything before the meeting, and I agreed. We set a preliminary date, 6 weeks out, to give Harrison time to finalize the resolution proposal and Priya time to complete the protective measures on the company accounts. 6 weeks. I had to maintain normal operations for 6 more weeks. I'm going to tell you what those 6 weeks were like, because I think it is important that you understand what it costs to do something like this correctly. When people hear a story about a confrontation, about a folder sliding across a conference table, they tend to imagine that the hard part is the confrontation. The hard part is not the confrontation. The confrontation is actually the easiest part because by then you are done collecting and waiting and maintaining a face that does not belong to you. The hard part is the 6 weeks before. I went to work every day. I sat in meetings with Claudia. We had a budget review in early March where she presented a proposal for hiring 2 additional regional sales managers, and I reviewed the proposal and raised some concerns about the timing relative to our cash flow projections, and she listened to my concerns with her head tilted to the side and said, "You make a fair point, Renata. Let's table it for next quarter." She was pleasant. She was collegial. She sent me a message the following afternoon with an article about a new software platform that she thought might help our commercial contract tracking, and she wrote, "Thought of you when I saw this, your kind of thing," with a small smiley face at the end. I replied that it looked interesting. I bookmarked the article. I went home that evening and updated my documentation. The thing about maintaining a face that does not belong to you is that it has a physical cost. I was sleeping about 5 hours a night during those 6 weeks. Not because I was anxious, I had done my grieving already in the weeks after I had seen the preliminary audit numbers, but because my brain would not stop running through contingencies. What if she saw the account controls and asked questions? What if someone at the audit firm talked? What if Tamaz found out before the meeting and told her? What if my father, in a moment of grief or love, said something to her that tipped her off? I ran through every scenario. I had a response prepared for each one. I went to sleep running through scenarios and I woke up the same way. In the 4th week, Claudia asked me to lunch. Just us, she said. She wanted to talk about a personal matter. My stomach was completely calm when I read that message, which surprised me a little. I had been preparing for close calls, and this felt like it might be one, but my body had apparently accepted that this was just going to be how the next few weeks felt. We met at a restaurant near the main showroom, a quiet place she liked, with good natural light and a menu she knew well. She ordered a glass of white wine and a salad, and she was warm and easy to talk to, the way she always was when it was just the two of us and the power differential was less visible. The personal matter, it turned out, was about Tamaz. She was worried about him. She said he had seemed distracted lately, possibly struggling personally, and she wondered if I had noticed anything. She wanted us to check in on him together as a family. I said I had noticed he seemed a bit quieter than usual and that I agreed we should reach out to him. I asked if something specific had prompted her concern. She shook her head and sipped her wine. "I just noticed things," she said. "I always have, you know how I am." I nodded. "I do," I said. She looked at me across the table. She had very clear eyes, the same dark brown as our father's, and she looked at me with a kind of affectionate assessment that I had seen 1,000 times and had, for a long time, experienced as love. "I'm glad you came back home," she said. "I know the CFO role isn't always the most exciting thing in the world, but you're really good at it, and it matters, having someone I trust in that role." I held eye contact. I kept my expression warm and open, and I said, "It matters to me too." And then I asked her about her daughter's school project, and she laughed and told me about it for the next 15 minutes, and we split a dessert and went back to work. She trusted me in that role. $627,000 trusted in that role. I did not sleep well that night. In the fifth week, Harrison sent me the final version of the resolution proposal. It was a 43-page document, and I read every page twice. The proposal outlined three elements: a full restitution plan covering the $627,000 plus interest to be paid back to the company over a structured timeline or in a lump sum, a governance reform package that would tighten financial controls, eliminate the unilateral signatory authority on the discretionary account, and add an independent director to the board, and a succession framework that addressed Claudia's role going forward, with options ranging from a structured transition out of the CEO position to a reduced operational role with enhanced oversight. The proposal did not include a criminal referral. That was a deliberate decision. Harrison had advised that including a preemptive criminal referral would eliminate the possibility of voluntary restitution and make the board meeting an adversarial proceeding from the first moment. The threat was implicit in the evidence. We did not need to say it out loud. Anyone reading the audit report would understand what the alternative to voluntary restitution looked like. I approved the final document. I signed the authorization for Harrison to file the protective measures on the company accounts, which would go into effect 48 hours before the board meeting. The protective measures meant that no transfers above a certain threshold could be processed without dual authorization, mine and my father's. This was framed, in the internal banking documentation, as a routine governance update. Claudia was copied on the banking notification. She replied with a brief email: "Good housekeeping, thanks for handling this." She pulled her hand through her hair at the next team meeting and mentioned casually that she had seen the banking update and thought it was sensible. She did not call me, she did not ask questions, she was not worried, and that told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly she had convinced herself that she was safe. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. The Thursday I had been building toward for 14 months. The Thursday I had thought about it too in the morning more times than I could count. I had the folder ready 4 days before. 5 copies of the audit report, the preliminary findings, the Meridian Creative Group transaction records, and the resolution proposal. 1 for each board member, my father, my mother, Claudia, Tamaz, and the 5th copy, the one that would sit in the center of the table, was mine. My mother did not know yet. This was the piece of the sequencing that Harrison and I had debated the most. Priya had argued strongly that my mother should be briefed before the meeting. Harrison had argued that briefing her in advance created a risk that she would reach out to Claudia, not out of complicity, but out of maternal instinct, out of the same impulse that had made my father ask if Claudia would go to prison. I had agreed with Harrison. My mother would find out at the meeting. That was going to be painful. I had made my peace with it. The night before the meeting, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I had done this correctly. I had done everything correctly. I had the evidence, I had the legal framework, I had the stage. I had protected my father's company, and I had done it cleanly, and I had done it in a way that Claudia could not challenge or diminish or make disappear with a graceful pivot. But she was still my sister. She had driven me to that parking lot and taught me how to parallel park when I was 15 years old. She had stayed on the phone with me for 3 hours when I got my CPA exam results back. She had sent me a handwritten card every year on my birthday for 38 years. I thought about all of that. I let myself think about it, and then I put the folder in my bag and went to bed. The next morning, I drove to the Solano Family Interiors main office. The board meeting was in the second-floor conference room, the one with the long table and the windows that looked out over the parking lot. I arrived 20 minutes early. I placed the folders at each seat. I set a copy of the resolution proposal at my own seat, and I sat down and I waited. I heard Claudia's voice in the hallway before she came in. She was talking to someone, laughing at something, her voice carrying easily the way it always did. She came through the door and saw me sitting there, and she smiled and said, "You're early. Big agenda today?" I smiled back. "Just organized," I said. She sat down across from me. She pulled her chair in. She looked at the folder in front of her seat and reached for it with the same casual ease she brought to everything. I watched her hand close over the folder. I watched her look at the cover page. I watched the Cartier bracelet go still. And I said, quietly and without any tremor in my voice, because I had been an auditor for 12 years and I knew exactly what came next, "I think we should wait for everyone to be seated before we open those." She looked up at me, and for the first time in 38 years, I saw something in her eyes that she had never shown me before. Not the affectionate assessment, not the calculated warmth, something raw and sudden, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, something that looked briefly like recognition. She set the folder down, she folded her hands on the table, and she waited. If you're still with me, stay, because what I did next in that conference room is the reason I am telling you this story at all, and it is something I spent 14 months preparing for and 3 seconds executing, and I want you to understand exactly how it happened. My father came in next, with my mother beside him. He met my eyes for a moment when he came through the door. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. He sat down at the head of the table. the way he had been sitting at the head of that table for 30 years, and my mother sat beside him and looked at the folder in front of her with the mild curiosity of someone who has not been told to be afraid of it yet. Tamaz came in 2 minutes later. He was carrying a coffee and scrolling his phone, and he sat down next to Claudia and said something to her under his breath that made her look at him briefly and look away. He put his phone down. He noticed the folders. He reached for his, and Claudia put her hand on his arm, not grabbing, just resting, and he paused and looked at her and then looked at me. His hand went to the folder and stayed there without opening it. Harrison came in last and took the chair at the end of the table opposite my father. He was not a board member. He had been introduced in the meeting invitation I had sent as a legal advisor engaged to assist with a governance matter. Claudia had replied to that meeting invitation asking who had engaged the legal advisor and for what purpose. I had replied that it was related to the independent audit findings and that the full details would be presented at the meeting. That was the only time in the entire 14 months that I felt anything that might have been cruelty. Writing that reply, watching the 3 dots appear on my screen as she typed a response, watching the dots stop, watching her send nothing. When everyone was seated, I opened my copy of the folder. I aligned it precisely in front of me. I looked around the table at my father, at my mother, at Tamaz, at Harrison, and finally at Claudia, who was looking at me with an expression that was very controlled and very still, and had something underneath it that I could feel from across the table. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "I need to walk you through the results of the independent audit of the discretionary account and several associated accounts." The audit was conducted by an independent firm and certified in February of this year. The findings are documented in the folder in front of each of you. I am going to summarize the key findings, and then we will have the opportunity to discuss the resolution proposal, which begins on page 31. My mother opened her folder. She looked at the cover page. She looked at me. Claudia had not moved. I took a breath, and I began. The audit report had 37 pages of findings. I walked through each section in the order it appeared, because that is how you present a forensic audit, chronologically, without editorializing, letting the numbers build their own case. My voice stayed even. My hands stayed flat on the table. I had presented findings like this dozens of times in my career to corporate boards and legal teams and insurance investigators, and the technique is always the same. You are not the one making the accusation. The documents are making the accusation. You are simply the person reading them out loud. I started with the overview, total transactions under review, time period covered, methodology used by the independent audit firm. I named the firm, I named the lead auditor, I stated the date of certification. These are the things you establish first because they are unchallengeable, and once you have established them, everything that follows carries their authority. My mother was reading along in her copy. She was on page 3. She had not yet looked up from the document. Tamaz had not opened his folder yet. He was watching me. Claudia had her hands in her lap and her eyes on the table's surface about 2 feet to the left of the folder she had not reopened. I noticed that she was pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger with a small, rhythmic pressure. It was a thing she did when she was working something out in her head. She had done it since we were children. Our mother used to tell her to stop because it left marks. I moved to the discretionary account. I walked through the account structure, the signatory history, the transaction volume. I stated the total transaction value under review. I stated the percentage of transactions that the auditors had been unable to document as legitimate business expenses. My mother looked up for the first time. "What does that mean?" she said. Her voice was careful. She was looking at me, not at Claudia. "It means those transactions, totaling $627,000 over 37 months, were processed through the company's accounts without any documented business purpose that the auditors could verify," I said. "The methodology for that determination is on pages 8 through 12. The thumbnail stopped pressing. Harrison placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. It was a neutral gesture, but it was also a signal, a small professional marker that said he was present, and this was a formal proceeding. My father had not moved since he sat down. I moved to section 2, the vendor account, Meridian Creative Group, I said. I saw Tamaz finally reach for his folder, open it, and start scanning. Meridian Creative Group was registered as a vendor in Solano Family Interiors accounts payable system in the first quarter of 2019. Between that date and the fourth quarter of 2021, the company received 43 invoices totaling $214,000. The invoices described interior design consulting services. The audit found no work product, no deliverable documentation, no meeting records, no correspondence, and no business address for Meridian Creative Group. The registered agent for the entity is listed in the appendix on page 22. I watched Tamaz turn to page 22. Claudia did not look at her folder. She already knew what was on page 22. Tamaz found the page. He read the registered agent name. He read it again. Something crossed his face that was not quite confusion and not quite recognition. It was the expression of a person in the moment before understanding arrives, when they can feel it coming but cannot yet see its shape. He stopped. He looked at the page again. That's the name of Claudia's accountant, her personal accountant. Yes, I said. The audit addressed that connection on pages 23 through 25. Tomas. Claudia's voice was very quiet, very controlled. Let Renata finish her presentation. It was, I noted, the first time she had spoken in 19 minutes. Tomas looked at her. He looked at the page. He looked at me. He did not say anything else, but he turned to page 23 and kept reading. I moved to section 3, the reimbursement claims. This was the section I had dreaded presenting the most, not because it was the most damaging, the Meridian transactions were the most damaging, but because the reimbursement claims were the most personal. They were the clearest evidence of something that had required sustained, deliberate, daily effort. You do not submit false reimbursement claims by accident. You do not accidentally pay private school tuition out of a company expense account 47 times over 37 months. You do it on purpose every time, knowing exactly what you're doing, and you count on the person whose job it is to catch you either not looking closely enough or not being willing to make the call. She had counted on both of those things for me for almost 3 years. I read through the categories: travel, personal services, education expenses, home improvement. Each line had a date, a transaction reference, and a documented finding from the audit team. I read them without inflection. I did not look at Claudia while I read them. I looked at the page and I let the numbers speak. My mother made a sound that was not a word. It was very small, barely audible, and she pressed her fingers to her lips and looked at my father, and he was looking at the table and he did not look back at her. I want to stop you right there. Claudia's voice had changed. The control was still there, but underneath it was a new quality, something tight and brittle that I had never heard from her before. She was looking at me now, full eye contact finally. These are preliminary audit findings. This firm doesn't have full context for how our expense accounts have operated historically. Dad used that discretionary account for. The audit team reviewed 30 years of transaction records, I said. The historical usage patterns are addressed on pages 14 through 17. The transactions under review represent a statistically significant deviation from all prior periods, including periods when your father had sole signatory authority. I'm just saying that there are explanations. Claudia, my father's voice. He had not spoken yet, and when he spoke, the room shifted in a way that was almost physical, not loud, not angry, just final. Let your sister finish. The thumbnail started pressing again. I finished section 3. I moved to the resolution proposal, starting on page 31. I outlined the 3 components: full restitution, governance reform, succession framework. I presented each component without editorializing. I noted that the proposal was a starting point for board discussion, not a unilateral decision, and that we would have the opportunity to discuss all 3 components after the presentation. Then I closed my folder, and I looked at my sister. She was looking at me with an expression that I had never seen from her before in 38 years, and I want to describe it accurately because I spent a long time afterward trying to find the right words for it. It was not devastation. It was not guilt. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has just watched the ground they were standing on shift beneath their feet and has not yet decided whether to fall or find new footing. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes. I could almost see it running. She was looking for the move, even now, even here. She was looking for the graceful pivot. I want to speak with an attorney before we continue this conversation, she said. Her voice was completely level. I have the right to do that. Absolutely, Harrison said, speaking for the first time. You do have that right. However, the board still has the authority to discuss the governance and succession items today regardless of your participation. You are welcome to step out. She looked at him. She looked at me. She looked at my father, who was still looking at the table. She did not step out. What happened next took about 40 minutes of discussion, most of which I am going to condense because the forensic details were presented and they were documented and they were certified, and there was ultimately no path for Claudia to challenge them in that room. What I want to tell you about instead is the moment that changed the shape of everything, the moment that I had not planned for, that arrived sideways from a direction I had not anticipated. It was Tomas. He had been quiet through the entire presentation. He had turned pages in his folder at the appropriate moments, and he had not spoken except for that one observation about the registered agent name. But about 30 minutes into the board discussion, when Claudia was in the middle of a statement about historical context and accounting practices, Tomas put both hands flat on the table and looked at her. Claudia, he said, just that, just her name. She looked at him. Did you take that money? The room went to a different kind of quiet than it had been before, not the professional, careful quiet of a board proceeding, something more raw. Claudia looked at our brother for a long moment. The calculation was still running behind her eyes. I watched her assess him the same way she had been assessing me for years, measuring the distance between where he was and where he could become a problem. It's more complicated than, Claudia. His voice was not loud. It was not angry either. It had something in it that I recognized as the particular grief of a person who has just understood something they had been avoiding understanding. Did you take money from our parents' company? Her chin lifted slightly. I made investments in the growth of this business for years without adequate compensation. The board never properly addressed executive compensation structure, and that is not what I asked you." She looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she looked at her folder. She pressed her thumbnail into her index finger once more and stopped. "I want to speak with an attorney," she said. Tomas leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he looked at me. And he nodded once, a small, specific nod that was not agreement with what Claudia had done and was not approval of every decision I had made in the past 14 months. It was something simpler than that. It was acknowledgement. It was my brother saying, with a single motion of his head, that he saw what was in front of him and he was not going to look away from it. That meant more to me than I expected it to. The board voted on the governance measures that day. My father voted yes. My mother, whose hands had been shaking since page 14, voted yes. Tomas voted yes. I voted yes. Claudia did not vote. She had her attorney on the phone by the time the vote was called, speaking in a low voice with her face angled toward the window, and Harrison recorded her abstention in the meeting minutes. But that is not where the false submission happened. The board meeting was the revelation. The false submission, the chess move, the performance, the thing that took all of my training to execute, that happened 3 weeks later. And it is the part of this story where I am most aware of the line between strategy and something else, something colder, and I have made my peace with which side of that line I stood on. Here is what happened. Claudia engaged an attorney, a sharp one, a litigator named Gregory Fasciola, who had a reputation for turning business fraud cases into protracted family disputes. His strategy, which became apparent within the first week, was to frame the entire matter as a compensation grievance rather than a theft. His argument was that Claudia had been underpaid relative to her role for years, that the board had failed its fiduciary duty to her specifically, and that the transactions in question represented a form of self-help remediation that, while procedurally irregular, was not without equitable basis. It was a creative argument. It was also legally thin. But Gregory Fasciola was not trying to win on the legal merits. He was trying to drag the proceeding out long enough that the company suffered, that my parents suffered, and that I got tired of fighting. He did not know me well. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Gregory requested a mediation session. He framed it as an opportunity for the parties to reach a resolution without litigation. Harrison advised me that this was worth attending, that mediations in family business disputes sometimes produced genuine outcomes, and that even if this one did not, it would give us valuable information about Claudia's strategy. We met at a law office downtown, neutral ground, a conference room on the 14th floor with floor-ceiling windows and a mediator named Dr. Loretta Ewan who had 22 years of family business dispute experience and the particular quality of a person who has seen every possible version of the worst day in a family's life and has learned to be completely unshockable. She opened the session with a brief statement about the process and then looked at Gregory Fasciola and nodded. Gregory's opening was 40 minutes long. It was polished and it was specific, and it cited 6 cases and 2 academic articles on equitable compensation in closely held family businesses. At the end of it, he presented a counterproposal. Claudia would acknowledge that the transactions had been procedurally improper, would agree to repay $300,000 to the company over a 5-year period without interest, and would retain her position as CEO subject to enhanced oversight. In exchange, the company would formally acknowledge that her compensation had been below market for a period of at least 4 years, would pay her a retroactive adjustment of $140,000, and would drop any inquiry that might have a criminal referral dimension. He then slid a document across the table, a draft settlement agreement, 16 pages. He looked at me when he did it, not at Harrison, at me. And he said with a pleasant professional directness that was designed to carry a message underneath the words, "I think you'll find this is a generous offer given the circumstances, Renata. Your sister has been the operational heart of this company for a long time. Dismantling that comes at a cost your family may not be fully prepared to absorb." I looked at the document. I reached for it slowly, the way a person reaches for something heavy. I turned to the first page. I read it for a moment. Then I set it down and looked at my hands. I let my lower lip do something very small and very controlled. A slight compression, not a tremor, but the precursor to one, the kind of thing a person does when they are working very hard not to show emotion and not entirely succeeding. I had practiced this in front of my bathroom mirror twice, not the emotional state, just the physical expression of the effort to suppress it. Claudia had been doing this to me for years. She had been performing warmth, and I had experienced it as real. Performing was something I was more than capable of. "Can I have a moment?" My voice was quiet, softer than usual. Gregory said, of course. He looked satisfied. He looked like a person who had seen this particular softening before and knew what it meant. I looked across the table at Claudia. She was watching me with an expression that was trying to be professional neutrality, but had something behind it that I recognized from our childhood, from the moments when she had been winning an argument and knew it. a small, barely visible settling of the shoulders. A release of tension she had been carrying. She thought I was breaking. I kept my eyes on the document. I turned a few pages slowly. I paused at the restitution schedule. I sighed just slightly, just enough. My hand, resting on the table beside the document, was not entirely steady. I had learned the trick to that in my late 20s from a senior partner at my audit firm who used it in depositions. You do not pretend to shake. You hold your hand in a position that creates microtremor naturally by tensing the muscle slightly below the surface where it cannot be seen. The result is a hand that appears to be barely suppressing something. Harrison was looking at his notepad. He did not look at me. We had discussed this the night before, and he understood his role precisely. I stopped. I looked at my hands. I don't want to go to court. My voice had a roughness in it that sounded very much like something being swallowed. I don't want to put my parents through that. I don't want to put our family through that. Across the table, Claudia leaned very slightly forward. Gregory kept his expression neutral, but I could see the internal calculation. He thought he had read me correctly. He thought the 14 months of documentation and the forensic audit and the board meeting were the extent of what I had, and that now, faced with a protracted legal fight and the prospect of genuine family fracture, I was discovering the limits of my own resolve. He thought he knew exactly what kind of person I was. He thought I was the kind of person who, at the end, would choose peace over justice. I understand, Gregory said. That's a very reasonable concern, and I think it reflects well on you, honestly. I let the compliment land. I let it do the work he intended it to do. My shoulders dropped slightly. The 300,000, I said. Is there any flexibility on the timeline? If it's over 3 years instead of 5, I think that would feel. I paused. I pressed my lips together once more real, more like an actual acknowledgement. Gregory looked at Claudia. A small exchange, barely a glance, between attorney and client. The glance said, she's negotiating on the margin. She's accepted the framework. Close it. I think we can work with 3 years, Gregory said. Subject to my client's confirmation, of course. Claudia unfolded her hands on the table. She nodded once very calmly, the way a person nods when they are allowing something rather than agreeing to it. She had that quality exactly right. She had always had it. Even now, she could not help performing the larger version of herself. There's one other item, I said. I reached into the folder in front of me and withdrew a single document, 2 pages, paperclipped. I slid it across to Harrison without looking at Gregory. I would want this addendum included. It's a governance clause. Specifically, it would require that all transactions above a $25,000 threshold in the discretionary account and all successor accounts require dual board member authorization for the duration of the repayment period. Gregory took the document from Harrison. He read it. He turned to page 2. He read that as well. His expression did not change, but I watched his eyes go over the specific language on page 2 very carefully, and then he put the document down on the table and looked at me. This is fairly standard governance language, he said. I know, I said. I drafted it. He looked at the document again. He looked at me. He looked at Claudia. Here is what Gregory Fasciola did not know, and what Claudia almost certainly did not tell him, because to tell him would have required admitting a level of specific knowledge that was inconvenient for her defense. The governance addendum I had just slid across the table was not merely a procedural clause. Embedded in the language on page 2, in a subsection titled Scope of Authorization Requirements, was a provision that obligated both authorizing board members to review and sign off on all prior period transaction documentation for any account subject to the new controls. As part of that review process, they would be required to certify the completeness and accuracy of that documentation. What that meant in practical terms was that Claudia's signature on the settlement agreement, if she signed the addendum, would constitute a formal attestation to the accuracy of the prior period transaction records, the same records that were currently the subject of the audit findings. She would be signing off on the very documentation that documented the diversion. This was the trap, not a dramatic one, not a Hollywood revelation. Just a precise, boring, legally devastating piece of governance language that Harrison had drafted and that I had inserted into a document I presented as a minor procedural addition at the moment when Claudia believed she had already won. Gregory was a good attorney. He was reading page 2 again more carefully now, and I could see the moment he found it, a slight pause, a barely perceptible recalibration. But he was also an attorney who had just spent 40 minutes presenting a client in the best possible light, and who had a client across the table who was radiating the quiet satisfaction of a person who had just watched their younger sister fold. And the clause, read quickly, looked exactly like what I had described, standard governance language. It required a specific and careful reading to understand what the certification obligation on page 2 actually meant. He made a decision. I watched him make it. He put the document down and looked at his client and gave a small professional nod that said, acceptable. I signed the settlement agreement. My hand was not entirely steady on purpose. The tremor was precisely calibrated. I set the pen down and looked at my hands in my lap for a moment, and I did not let my expression change. Claudia signed. She used a heavy pen she took from her own bag the way she always did. She signed with the same clean, confident signature she had been putting on company documents for 15 years. Dr. Ewan initialed the final pages. Gregory collected his copies. He shook my hand with the firm professional warmth of a person who considers themselves to have handled a difficult situation skillfully. "I think this is a good outcome for everyone," he said. I looked at him. "I think so too," I said. Outside in the parking lot, Harrison and I walked to our separate cars without speaking until we were far enough from the building entrance that we could not be seen from the lobby windows. Then he stopped and looked at me. His expression was as close to something like awe as I had ever seen from a corporate litigator. He said quietly, "She signed page 2. "Yes," I said. "She did not know what page 2 was." "No." He looked at the building for a moment. "Renata, you are going to be a very difficult person to ever practice against." I smiled. For the first time that day, the smile was entirely real. "Call me Monday morning," I said. "I want to walk you through the referral letter." I drove home. I sat in my car in my driveway for about 10 minutes without going inside. I thought about Claudia's confident signature. I thought about page 2. I thought about Gregory Fasciola reading the clause and making the wrong calculation, and how the wrong calculation had looked exactly like the right one from the outside, which is the thing about traps built from precision. They look like concessions until the moment they close. She had been building her strategy on her read of me for 38 years. And her read of me had one fundamental flaw. She had always understood me as the younger sister who needed to be managed. She had never understood me as the forensic auditor who had been watching her for 14 months. She thought she had one. By Monday morning, she would understand exactly what she had signed. The referral letter went to the district attorney's office on the following Tuesday. Harrison prepared it. It was accompanied by the full certified audit report, the Meridian Creative Group transaction records, the payroll system documentation, the settlement agreement, and the addendum, specifically page 2. The cover letter noted that the signatory to the settlement agreement had, as a condition of that agreement, attested to the accuracy of the prior period transaction records, which the independent audit had found to contain $627,000 in undocumented diversions. She had signed an attestation to the accuracy of documentation that proved the diversion. In a criminal proceeding, that attestation was significant, not dispositive, but significant. It removed certain avenues of defense. It narrowed the road she had to travel. Gregory Fasciola called Harrison 3 days after the referral was filed. The call was professional, very controlled. He asked specifically whether we had anticipated that the addendum would be used in connection with a criminal referral. Harrison told him truthfully that the addendum had been drafted as governance language and that its implications in the context of the referral had been a consequence of the language as written. He was very precise about this. Everything was true. Everything was also exactly what it was. Gregory was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She didn't read page 2. "No," Harrison said. "She didn't." There was a pause. "That was very well done," Gregory said. Harrison thanked him. He called me immediately afterward and told me what Gregory had said, and the word "well done" from a litigator who had just realized he had been outmaneuvered by a piece of governance language drafted by an accountant was one of the cleaner satisfactions of the entire process. The district attorney's office opened an investigation in April of 2022. The investigation ran for 7 months. I want to be honest about what those 7 months were like, because the part of this story that people want to skip past, the part that does not fit neatly into a narrative of justice, is the part where you have done everything correctly and then you still have to wait. I went to work every day. Not at Solano Family Interiors, the board had accepted the governance reform package, and as part of that package, my own role had been restructured with enhanced independence, and the new independent director, a woman named Beatrice Alumide, had joined the board. Claudia had been suspended from her operational duties pending the investigation, which meant the day-to-day CEO functions were distributed between Tamaz and a hired interim executive. The company was running. It was not running the way it had run under Claudia's leadership, because no company transitions that cleanly when its CEO is suddenly absent. But it was running. I went to work. I processed the monthly close. I reviewed the commercial contract division numbers, and they were still solid. I had meetings with Beatrice, who was sharp and direct and asked questions that made me think harder than I expected to. I had dinner with my parents on Thursdays when I could. My mother did not talk about Claudia at those dinners. My father sometimes asked me quietly if there was any news. I told him what I could. Tamaz and I had a conversation in June of that year. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning, and he asked me, in the direct, slightly uncomfortable way that Tamaz asks hard things, whether I had known when I came home in 2019 that this was where it was going. I told him no. I told him I had come home because I believed in the business and I believed we could build something together. I told him I had not known what Claudia was doing until I started looking, and I had not started looking because I suspected her. I had started looking because the numbers felt slightly wrong, the way numbers sometimes feel slightly wrong to someone who has been reading them long enough. He was quiet for a moment. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Do you think she thought she would get away with it? I thought about this honestly. I think she stopped thinking about whether she would get away with it after a while, I said. I think it started as something she told herself was temporary, and then it kept going, and eventually it became just the way things worked. She had access. Nobody was checking closely enough, and I paused. She didn't think I would look. Tamaz looked at his coffee. Because you were the little sister. Because I was the little sister, I said. He nodded. He did not say anything else about it. He asked me about a commercial client I was in the middle of negotiations with, and we talked about that for a while, and when I drove home, I sat in the car again for a few minutes in the driveway. She had not thought I would look. I had been looking for 12 years. She had known me for 38. She had never once seen what I was looking with. The investigation concluded in November of 2022. The district attorney filed charges in December, 1 count of embezzlement, 1 count of wire fraud, and 2 counts of falsifying business records. The embezzlement charge carried a potential sentence of up to 10 years. The wire fraud charges related specifically to the Meridian Creative Group invoice scheme, which had involved electronic transfers and therefore fell under federal wire fraud statutes as well, creating an additional layer of exposure that Gregory Fasciola and Claudia had to manage on top of the state charges. Gregory negotiated. That is what Gregory Fasciola does, and he was genuinely skilled at it. The negotiations took 5 months. I was not party to those negotiations. The charges were filed by the district attorney's office, and my involvement in the criminal proceeding was as a witness, not as a party. I provided documentation. I answered questions from the prosecution team. I sat in a room with 2 assistant district attorneys in March of 2023 and walked them through the audit findings with the same precise, unemotional presentation I had given at the board meeting 14 months earlier. One of the Adas, a young woman who reminded me a little of myself at that age, very focused, very careful with her questions, looked at the documentation at the end of the session and said, "You maintained this documentation for how long before the board meeting?" 14 months from the first observation to the formal audit mandate, I said. And the audit itself ran for about 5 months after that. She looked at the files. You didn't say anything during those 14 months. No, why not? I thought about how to explain this to someone whose training was in law rather than audit. Because I needed the evidence to be unimpeachable, I said. If I had said something earlier, before the audit was commissioned, before the methodology was established, before the certified report, I would have had an allegation. What I had at the board meeting was a finding. Those are different things. Allegations can be disputed. Certified findings are much harder to dislodge. She wrote something down, then she looked up. And you had no idea the total was that large until the audit came back. I had a preliminary figure that the auditors revised upward twice during the process, I said. But no, I did not know the final number until February of 2022. She nodded slowly. That must have been quite a moment. Yes, I said, it was. The plea agreement was reached in April of 2023. Claudia pleaded guilty to 1 count of embezzlement and 1 count of falsifying business records. The wire fraud counts were dropped as part of the agreement. She was sentenced in June of 2023, 3 years of supervised probation, full restitution of $627,000 to the company, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent prohibition on serving as an officer or director of any corporation or business entity in the state. She did not go to prison. I want to be honest about how I felt about that, because the honest answer is more complicated than I expected it to be. When Harrison called me with the sentencing terms, I sat very still for a moment and then I said, okay. I stayed on the phone while he walked me through the details of the restitution schedule and the probation conditions and the officer-director prohibition, and I took notes in my precise, habitual way, and when he was done, I thanked him and I stayed in my chair for a long time after I hung up. She did not go to prison. She would pay back every dollar under legal obligation over a structured period. She would never run a company again, not legally, not in the state. She had pleaded guilty on the record. All of it was documented. All of it was permanent. I do not know exactly what I expected to feel when it was over. I had spent so many months focused on the doing of it, the documentation, the audit, the sequencing, the board meeting, the addendum, the referral, that I had not spent much time thinking about the feeling that would come when there was nothing left to do. It was quieter than I expected. Not disappointing, just quiet. The way a long, complicated piece of work feels when you finish it and the file closes for the last time. I have been in this city for 5 years now. The house I bought 8 blocks from the main showroom, I still live in it. I renovated the kitchen the year after the sentencing, and I put a small desk in the back room that gets morning light, and that is where I work most days. My consulting practice generates enough that I could close the CFO position at Solano Family Interiors if I wanted to, but I have not wanted to. The company is doing well. Tamaz is the interim CEO now. We are working through the formal transition, and he is better at it than anyone expected, including himself. Beatrice Alumide is a genuinely excellent board member and has improved our governance structure in ways that go beyond anything I proposed in the resolution package. The commercial division closed its strongest year last year. My parents celebrated their anniversary in September, and my mother danced for the first time in 2 years. Claudia is living in a different city now. She has a small apartment there, I am told. Her daughter is with her. I do not know much else about what her daily life looks like, and I have decided that I do not need to know. She is making the restitution payments on schedule. Harrison monitors the account and reports to me quarterly, and she has not contacted me since the sentencing. I have not contacted her either. I do not know what we would say to each other, and I have made a kind of peace with not knowing. My father asked me once, about a year after the sentencing, whether I was glad I had done it the way I did it, the methodical way, the patient way. I thought about the question seriously before I answered because it deserved a serious answer. I told him yes. Not because it felt good, not most of it, but because at every step I had acted from what I knew rather than from what I felt, and the outcome was one that could not be challenged or diminished or made into something other than what it was. The company was intact. The documentation was airtight. The restitution was legally enforceable. The truth was on the record. I had been an auditor for 12 years when I walked into that board meeting. Every one of those years had pointed toward that folder. Every reconciliation, every engagement where I had sat across from someone who believed they had covered their tracks and showed them exactly where the tracks were visible, all of it had been preparation, though I had not known at the time what I was preparing for. She counted on the little sister. She did not count on the auditor. Those are the same person. She just never looked closely enough to see it. I have been called a lot of things since that board meeting. Calculating, cold. Someone who let things go too far for too long when I should have acted sooner. I have thought about each of those things seriously, and I have decided that I can live with all of them. I can live with them because I know exactly what I built, and I know exactly what it cost, and I know that the company my parents spent 30 years building is still standing and still producing and still employing the people who have worked there for a decade and a half. That is the thing I am most proud of, not the folder, not the addendum. Not Gregory Fasciola's grudging professional compliment in that parking lot. The company is still standing. That is what I came home for. If there is someone in your life who has been counting on you not to look closely, who has been building something at your expense and relying on your affection or your patience or your willingness to keep the peace, I want you to know something. Looking closely is not a betrayal. It is not a failure of love. It is the clearest possible expression of respect for what is real and what is true. Audit the things that matter to you. Document what you find. Give the evidence the stage it deserves. Your folder is waiting. You just have to be willing to open it. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment below. Tell me your city. Tell me if you've ever been the person in the room who was supposed to not look. I read every single one.